So what is Label Studio? Well, if you just gathered, this is an open source data labeling platform. So it's not like every other labeling platform, but it is an open source labeling platform. You can annotate data on there. You can organize your data fairly easily. It's very flexible, which is great. It's easy to use and it has an intuitive UI. I was able to, I first learned about Label Studio when I came to DagsHub half a year ago or so, and I was able to learn it fairly quickly. It supports many different data types. So you just saw images, but it supports a lot more. We're going to go through them in a little bit. And as you also saw, it supports machine learning assisted labeling, which is fantastic. So it's flexible enough that we can actually run our own machine learning models and have it help us with our labeling. It doesn't matter if your machine learning pipeline is a standard supervised machine learning pipeline. Label Studio will help you with this area roughly. Or if you have a more exotic active learning pipeline, Label Studio is still good for you because it'll help you with this area. So essentially, any kind of labeling you need to do, Label Studio can help you with. Let's go quickly over some of the supported data types. You saw images, but in addition to the data types, what's also important is what kind of annotations it supports on them. As you can see, in not just bounding boxes, which you saw with the squirrels, it also does segmentation either with polygons or with masks. It does key point labeling and others. Along with audio, you can hear and see your audio waveforms in the interface, in the UI interface, and you can then use it to annotate, for instance, speech recognition or speaker segmentation or sound events. It supports video, which is kind of like images and audio put together, right? So it's an obvious next step. Text, which is very big nowadays, especially with stuff like ChatGPT and your text-to-image models. But text is good for summarization or semantic, sorry, I forget the word, but like let's go with text classification and partitioning. Structured data, if you need to pull data out of HTML or PDFs, it's good with that. And time series. So when you're writing your next machine learning model to predict stock prices and make $1 million, Label Studio is there for you too. It's got you covered. Before we get a little bit further, I do want to take some time to explain some terminology, not a lot of terminology, just a little bit that tripped me up when I first started. And I wanted to make sure I clarified them so that it's not a stumbling point. So let's talk about data. Now, we all know what data is. I'm not underestimating your intelligence, but I just want to make a point here. So data is, of course, interesting stuff to annotate. However, data is not what you give to your annotator within Label Studio. And this is what confused me initially. It's because you give your annotator a task. And what's the difference between a task and data? Well, a task is a single piece of data that's ready to be predicted. It's part of an entire job. And most importantly, it includes metadata relevant for predicting or annotating. So it's got all the information you need to be able to correctly annotate the data. So the difference is subtle, but it's an important difference, especially when you start looking at say Label Studio's API and you're wondering, how do I upload data? Well, maybe you need to look at tasks instead, or vice versa. Another interesting subtle difference might be prediction. Well, again, I don't want to insult your intelligence, but just to make things absolutely clear, we're talking about inference output from a machine learning model, much like in our demo we just had. That's different from an annotation, which is human created or approved. So what my machine learning model was doing, it wasn't returning annotated data back to Label Studio, it was returning a prediction. This prediction could then be turned into an annotation by a human annotator or a labeler. Okay, very subtle difference, but important to know so you don't trip yourself up. But Label Studio is great, but more importantly is, how does DagsHub integrate Label Studio? Or even better question to ask would be, how does DagsHub improve upon the labeling process using Label Studio? And this is actually where things get pretty exciting. So DagsHub has a repository. Each repository in DagsHub has a Label Studio workspace that can be attached to it. These workspaces have full access to your project files. Now, that sounds obvious, right? But think about it a little bit more. You no longer have to copy or you move your data around to get it labeled. This is extremely important. This is a very convenient thing. You don't have to upload to a server somewhere and just to get some stuff labeled. You don't have to email some pictures to your mom to get her to draw boxes around stuff anymore. You have it already in your repository, and Label Studio has access to it. So you can immediately start getting the labeling process going. You can have multiple labeling projects per workspace, but what's very cool is that you have a unique Git flow for labeling. And let's talk about Git flow really quickly. We'll do a little refresher in case you're not familiar with Git flow or you don't know what that terminology means. Git flow is, let's say you start with a repository. You have the main repository, the original repository, and it's got a commit. You want to start updating that repository from that commit, but you don't own that repository. So what do? You fork the original repository. You start making some changes and committing them. Maybe simultaneously, the original repo is also making changes and committing them. Well, you've come to the end of the changes that you want to make. So what do? You open a pull request back to the original repo. Today is a good day. The repo owner likes your pull request and wants to merge it back into his original repo or his or her original repo. This is fantastic. And now, though, a great part is someone could be simultaneously making other changes while you were making your changes, and they can all be merged back together using Git. Now, this is what we're used to doing with code, right? However, DagsHub's integration with Label Studio allows you to do this with data annotations. And if you think about that, that is extremely powerful. This gets me excited a lot. So imagine you have a lot of data that you need to have annotated. You have friends that can also do annotating, or let's just call it crowdsourcing annotations. Or let's say crowdsourcing, making a data set. Everyone can fork this original repo. They can annotate small sections of the data and merge them back in, and you start to fill in a big picture over time. So suddenly you're not doing 100,000 annotations, but you're spreading the work among a lot of people who are collaborating on labeling this data for you. And that's where this Git flow comes into play. Additionally, if you ever find that your model is diverging, like let's say you realize, hey, your model has diverged from what you expected to be, and you trace it back to be about a month ago. Because all of this is committed to Git, you can actually go find the commit where the model starts to diverge and start to debug what happened. You can rerun your experiments from that point on, see what changed, see what needs to be changed in order to fix the problem. The other thing, though, is, so how is DagsHub keeping track of these changes to your data annotations? So that gets into the nitty-gritty here. We're going to go over that really quickly so that if you ever come into a problem or if you ever want to see something, you know where to go look. When DagsHub commits your changes to a repo for data, specifically from Label Studio, it creates a hidden .label studio directory. And this hidden .label studio directory is at the top level of the repo. This is the source of truth for DagsHub annotations. Everything that's in there is the truth as far as DagsHub is concerned. The directory is going to contain a label config.xml. And this label config is your label schema. And what do I mean by label schema? Well, let's take a look at an example. This is basically telling Label Studio what kind of data it can expect. So in this case, an image, and what kind of labels or what kind of annotations should be associated with this data. In this case, rectangular labels, so bounding boxes. And you can see that the choices for what a bounding box might be is either Baby Yoda or Mando. Additionally, it has the color choices for the user interface. So this label config is the schema of the label and it only appears once in that .label studio directory. Additionally, the data that's really important is there is a single JSON file for each of your data files that you've annotated. If you haven't annotated something, there won't be a data file there. But if you've annotated something, DagsHub is going to create a JSON file inside this directory that uses a Label Studio format. And even if, for instance, when we looked earlier, I made 3 changes. I made 3 commits. I did 2 squirrels and 1 nothing, not squirrel. That image where nothing is will also have a JSON file. It will basically say that there are no squirrels found in that image, but it's important to know that it was actually annotated. But however, because this Label Studio directory is a flat directory, how does it deal with naming conflicts? Like say you have the same name under a train and a validation directory. You shouldn't do that, but let's just pretend you do, you made a mistake or something like that. Well, the file name of these JSON files is actually a SHA-1 hash of the path to the data file. This path is including the data file, and it's relative to the repo. So it's not the absolute path that's on your computer, it's relative to the repo. So it's always going to be the same regardless of whether you're looking at the repo on DagsHub, you're looking at the repo on Alice's computer, you're looking at the repo on Rom's computer. It's always going to be the same path, the relative path, and then the hash is going to be the same. If it's easier to understand by looking at code, this is how you might generate the name of the JSON file for each data file. So let's pretend you have the image file squirrels, squirrels, you hash it using SHA-1, you digest it, that will give you a 40-character hex string, and you add .json to it, and that's the name of the file in that .label studio directory. Sometimes that's handy to know if you ever need to debug something. Okay, we're going to do a web demo where I'm going to go over a lot of what we just talked about, show you the UI for Label Studio, and show you some other cool stuff. If you want to follow along, this QR code is the repo that I'm going to fork, or that I just forked in the demo, and we'll be showing you around a little bit. Okay, so if we go back here, we go back to our data set. I want to show you something first. If you remember, I committed those changes to the ML demo branch, and in this is my fork repo, right? In here, we see that .label studio directory that I mentioned. If you look here, I'm going to actually make this bigger since we don't need that server window anymore. These represent the 3 files that I annotated. This label config, as you see, is essentially that XML file that I showed the example of. A little bit different because we have squirrels instead of Baby Yoda. But if we click on one of these files, because right now this means nothing to me, I have no idea what file this is, right? But if we click on this file, we're going to see something cool. We're going to actually load the image. So DagsHub recognizes that this file, it knows that this file is associated with an annotation for an image. So it loads the image. Additionally, it'll show you the annotation in there, including the confidence score that was associated with that. Since we used a machine learning backend, each prediction it sent it sent with a confidence score. So now we know how confident it was that this was the squirrel. Additionally, we can then look at the next one. Yep, that's our squirrel again, 97%, great. And if we look at the last one, we should see just grass, nothing. Additionally, you could do it the other way around. If you're browsing your data, DagsHub shows you which images have been annotated by this symbol right here. So none of these have been annotated, but these 3 have. So if we click on one of these, it also tells you in this corner, there's an annotation. Look, it even warned me. There's an annotation in this file. If we click to see this, it'll take you back to the Label Studio directory and show you again what the annotation is for that file. Okay, well, let's go ahead and open up Label Studio. We're going to click on the annotations tab right here. We're going to click on the annotations tab right here. We're going to click on the annotations tab right here. There we go. Perfect. It worked the first time, right? I'm going to show you how to set up a new project. So this is my project for my demo, with the machine learning backend demo. Let's create a new project. This time we're just going to call it demo. I'm going to be very boring. And I'm going to commit to a branch, my cool demo. The reason I want to do this is I don't want to actually make my commits. I want to just create a new branch to start that whole Git flow process. So later, when we have the option to commit, you have the option to create a new branch commit, or you can do it ahead of time. I like to do it ahead of time just to make sure I'm on a separate branch and not committing directly to main. So we're going to create that project. And we have to click here to start. This brings up the Label Studio setup interface. So we're not quite in Label Studio yet, we're kind of in it. It defaults to this DagsHub tab, which is where we're going to select our data. But before we do that, if you were to set up your data now and you click save, it'll try to dump you into the Label Studio interface. However, because we haven't defined our labeling structure, it won't happen. So what I'm going to do is we're going to do something a little bit different. You saw the bounding boxes, but let's see something a little bit more interesting. Why don't we check out semantic segmentation with polygons? So we're going to make some really bad looking squirrels. Let's just say that. You have the default airplanes and cars. We don't need those. We're not looking at airplanes or cars. We're going to add a squirrel. We're going to spell it correctly. And I don't like this light red, so I'm going to pick a different color. Let's say a bright blue. I want to allow, this is up to you whether you want this or not. You can zoom with your control on the scroll wheel. You can show the zoom in and out controls. Great. And now I need to move all your pretty faces to the top so I can see the bottom. And I click on save. And now we're going to select our data directory. We have a data directory. We have 20 files in it. That's the correct data directory, just to make sure. We click save. We're not splitting text files because we don't have any text data, and we don't need to worry about treating files as custom tasks. So I'm going to click save. And now, because we've defined the labeling schema and selected our data, we get to see Heidi. This is Heidi. This is Label Studio's mascot, the possum. Okay. Now, in a typical workflow, what you would need to do is you would need to, just to get started, you could just click this button and do label all tasks. And that'll start taking you to a flow where it'll force you, or not force you, it'll give you one image at a time or one piece of data at a time and allow you to label it as you go along. Let's take a look at some of these other options first. So I'm not super interested in, for instance, predictions right now because the machine learning backend will come later, so I don't need to see the predictions column. I don't also need to see the source file path. I am kind of interested in seeing, for instance, maybe we want to see when it was created. So they're all created at the same time. That's not actually that interesting then. Or perhaps an annotation ID. There are no annotations ID. Okay. However, if we wanted to sort by a different field, we could also sort by, for instance, our creation time. That's kind of boring. All right, we'll do sorting later. But let's say we want to label these four tasks first. Remember, not data, tasks. What we can do is then select them, and then if we look here, we can just say label 4 tasks. Okay, so now we have our first squirrel. Congratulations. What we want to do is we want to zoom in. We can zoom in, and we can pan. Oh, we're gonna have to. Okay. Now we're going to label the squirrel by putting dots down. As you can see, it's fairly quick. And this is exactly what the squirrel looks like. He's a little bit like Max Headroom from the 80s, kind of blocky. It's weird that there was a natural squirrel like that. Normally they're a lot more fuzzy. All right, now we have our first squirrel annotated, and we can choose to submit this. And you'll see the count in the commit going up. Every time you submit, then this commit number goes up because you're actually making a change. So it's counting the number of changes that you're making. If we were going to do another one, we're going to do another one really quickly. And I'm doing very roughly just so we can get the idea. Perfect. It looks exactly like that. Submit. We have a commit of 2. Here we have nothing, so we can either skip or we could actually submit is better. If you weren't sure, like let's say, I'm not sure that's a squirrel, that might be, let's say, a groundhog. I don't want to accidentally incorrectly label this, so I'm going to skip this. And I'm done. No more data available for labeling. Now what I can do is I can go and commit this. When you commit, you have the option to actually also generate your annotations and add them to your project directly if you check this box. When you do so, you have a lot of different options of how you generate that data. This data will then be added to your repo and then will be version controlled with your repo. But I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to commit it to my cool demo branch. And now I can continue annotating. When we go back now to our wrong button, we go back to our annotations, we go back to our demo. Back to our demo. We say hello to Heidi again. Okay. What you can see here now is that your completed by times are now based on when you actually hit the submit button. So they're not when you hit that commit button, they're when you hit the submit button. You can see that it was I that annotated them. You see my avatar there, and if you hover over, you can see my name. You can see that this column right here is the number of annotations in the task. And this was the one that I skipped. That way, if you need to later, say filter by, not image, filter by canceled equals 1. Then you see all the ones that were canceled, and then perhaps you need to revisit those and send them to, say, a higher tier annotator, or have another set of eyes look at them to make sure that it's not what it is. An interesting point is these might also be, if you're doing, these might also be the harder examples you actually want to focus on for training a machine learning model. Let's cancel this. I want to see all the data again. There was something else. Yes. Okay. So you're like, oh, you know what? I forgot to export when I committed. I don't want to have to commit again just to export. We have this lovely export button here, which allows you to export the exact same data. The difference here is this won't export it and attach it to your repo. This will just basically allow you to download it to your computer. So if that's your preferred pipeline, then that's what you would do there. Let me think if there's anything else that we wanted to show before we move on. Yeah, so you can, of course, delete annotations, delete tasks, delete predictions, all that kind of cool stuff.